see all of our events coming up. We are also on Facebook. Where else do we put our stuff? We're in a number of different locations. But today we're going to be talking about reverse outlines for authors. Before I get too far, Sean, you want to tell us a little bit about next week?
Oh yes, for sure. And with a little South Park in the background right here, for sure, we had a lot of awesome things come up. We had so many ideas backed up for a while that I'm finally getting around to how a writer travels. Tips and tricks for making the most of traveling and being a writer at the same time. So it's totally possible to, like use those characters that you find, those locations that you find in your writing, because write what you know is always a good thing.
And we are also kind of new on our YouTube channel. We've been moving our things over kind of slowly, but if you are interested on our previous writers' lunches, or if you want to see these, if you can't make it on the Thursday, but want to be able to enjoy the programming, follow us at youtube.com at Writers Lunch. You can find us there. I'll ask Sean to pop that into the chat so you can find us. But that's where we are streaming now because Facebook wants to shut everything down, unfortunately. But let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about reverse outlines for authors. So let me pop open my screen here. And I should have done this sooner because I'm always slow. Okay, so a little bit about me before we go too far. I am Shannon Winton. If you don't know me yet, I'm one of the founders of Houston Independent Authors. I'm also a coordinator for the Houston chapter of the Editorial Freelancers Association, as well as the newly revived, or relatively recently revived, Houston Science Fiction and Fantasy Meetup. We tend to meet at the end of the month, the very last Monday of the month, over at Melange Creperie for nerdy fun. um, we also, oh, excuse me, I'm also a founder of Toneworks Editing. I've actually been a freelance developmental editor for over a decade now. And that's my jam. If you have science fiction, fantasy, mystery, that kind of thing, that's the sort of story that I tend to work on. And I'm also an educator for editors. I teach the editing science fiction and fantasy course for the Editorial Freelancers Association, where I teach new editors how to evaluate your writing so that they do a good job. And that's my background, at least some of it. And a lot of this all kind of wraps together into how you outline or how you revise and how you use an outline in your revisions. So, first questions first. What is a reverse outline? And the answer is really that it could be a lot of things. Reverse outlines essentially just are outlines that you make after the book is already written. There are some caveats because sometimes we write ourselves into a corner, and it's a good idea to get a bird's eye view of what's already there so you can figure out how to get out of that corner and see places where your brain has already found itself creating plot that maybe you on a conscious level didn't realize it was doing. And maybe you're in the corner because part of your brain is at odds with another part of your brain and how you've written the story, and what you really need to do is just choose one path. But anyway, the outline can be as detailed or vague. I do have some best practices I will talk about. And really, a reverse outline is useful when we're talking about fiction writing for planners, pantsers, and plantsers. Basically, anybody who's writing a book can benefit from a reverse outline. I do feel like reverse outlines are more often used by people who did not have a plan when they went in to start writing their book, when they were doing discovery writing. But it doesn't mean that if you are a planner that this is going to be useless to you, because planning is everything, but plans tend to go awry. So basically, if you're writing a story, you could probably use a reverse outline in between your drafts. However, there's other places where you might find yourself, outlining or putting an outline in, even if you aren't quite between, first draft and second, or second and third. So if, as we talked about already, if you've written yourself into a corner and you really don't see a way out. Reverse outlining is a great way to get a bird's eye view of the story and allow yourself to kind of see, oh, okay, I'm hitting this set of beats now. I know where I am. I can see where I went wrong. Or if you are still writing the story, and you're finding yourself flagging in your enthusiasm for the story, you're like, man, I feel like I've been writing this forever. Going back and doing a reverse outline and getting that bird's eye view might make you realize, oh, I'm actually closer to the end than I realized. Or, oh, wow, the reason that I'm not happy about this is because I threw XYZ in over here and I'm still trying to work on these things, but they're not really helping the book. They don't really fit. So when you're finding yourself kind of flagging for inspiration, or you're finding things hard to maneuver around, or again, you've written yourself into a corner, when you're finding the writing hard, having a reverse outline can often help you identify what's making that process hard for you, um, and in helping you determine ways of like getting past them. So there's a lot of benefits to a reverse outline. You could be doing it for a number of other things that I haven't listed here, but whenever you're finding things difficult as you're writing, it may be a good idea to be like, okay, what did I actually do over the past 40,000 words? Maybe I've accidentally shackled myself, and that's why this process seems much harder than it did, a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a number of different types of outlines. These are things that you would use before you write, but if you are a plantser or a pantser, again, you may not have done this because you were doing discovery writing, or you went in with a couple of ideas, or you had some scene blocks in your head, and now you're trying to make sure, on the second or third draft, that everything is cohesive and it's working well. And so you need something to visually represent your story, that isn't 50,000 words long, that isn't 100,000 words long, that isn't 150,000 words long in some genres. So let's look at them and kind of figure out, hey, does this work for you? Of course, there's billions of different types of outlines out there. And so what is something that you would want to use, maybe different than what I have on the screen. In all honesty, if you have preferred outline methods, go ahead and pop them in the chat. We might be able to talk about them even if I don't have a slide for them. Okay, so the first easiest way to do it is a scene outline. And this basically means you go through your entire book, and you kind of break your chapters down into scenes. Your chapter may have only one scene. You may have 3,000 words that focuses on one particular situation, circumstance, problem. It has the same characters, they're in the same place the entire time. You may just have that one scene. But often your chapters are broken down into numerous scenes because the chapter may be following a particular character, but they may travel around, they may engage with other characters, they may deal with one problem over here, but then get like rapidly pulled into another issue on the other side of town, or something like that. So the scene, the scene list and the chapter list would be different because you may have 3 scenes in chapter 4, and you may have like just one scene in chapter 5. But breaking things down into scenes helps get you that granular level, that will help you determine, like, does the scene actually work for the story and what's actually happening here, and make sure that you're using the appropriate size sections for your summarizations. So when you do the scene list, again, you're going to break down the chapters, if you use chapters to begin with, but you're going to break down your writing into events that happen in the same setting inside of that chapter, or there's one specific concern, or thematic issue, that is dealt with in that space. Generally, in these, you would expect to see some form of either shift or transformation. And by that, I mean, there is a problem. We could say it's a interpersonal problem. And maybe this is just spitballing, right? My character is having some sort of disagreement with her friend, and she doesn't know what the problem is. But she's trying to improve the friendship. So she brings her friend flowers. And maybe the bringing the friend flowers makes the friend realize, oh, I am supported. Let me tell you about my problems. That might just be one scene. Or we could make the problem worse. The first friend brings the second friend who's been absent flowers, and it turns out that friend has her girlfriend over, and her girlfriend sees this other woman bringing flowers and thinks that there's some sort of nefarious cheating going on. And now that problem is drastically worse, right? Or the problem evolves and becomes different. So maybe the first friend brings flowers over to the second friend. And when she gets there, the friend answers the door, but she's got 8 legs. And oh shit, the reason that the friend has been absent is because something supernatural is happening. And so the problem has deeper roots that are previously known. The complicating factors have evolved in this problem. But this is, regardless, this might just be one scene of the story. And so there is a shift or transformation. Usually that shift or transformation is either on the physical level or it's on the emotional level. And I'm going really hard on this because when people do their scene list, sometimes if they do the entire chapter and the chapter is 4,000, 5,000 words long, it gets really hard to encompass what's actually in there. So you write 1 or 2 general statements about what happens in that chapter, and that is the basis of your scene, excuse me, of the scene, and that is the basis of your scene list. And when you do that, you get to add more stuff in based upon what's important to you. Um, Talk about what that change is in your scene list. What is actually changing? Or what triggers the change? Is that actually on the page? This can be anything, the emotional experience of what's happening, a character making a decision. They could even act on impulse. They could have impacts on the physical world. They could have a loss of money, loss of time, loss of whatever. Something occurs that increases sexual tension. There is change. So make sure that you isolate and indicate what that change is. And then when you write these things down, try to be specific, use objective terms when you're describing this stuff. Because right now you know what you're talking about because the story is right for you. When you go back to evaluate your outline, if you don't know what you were trying to say because you used vague terms or generalizations, it's going to be less useful. So if you're like, they talk and then leave, like, granted, that is pretty specific, but what did they talk about? What changed in that conversation? Where did they go? So give yourself enough granular detail in your summary that you can pinpoint when you go back and look at it, like what actually happened. So they talk about an abortion and leave to go to the clinic is a lot more specific. Or, they talk about running away together and then they leave to get money. Very specific. Those things will let you know how this was plot driven, or if you can't figure out how to put that in there, whether the scene maybe is just placeholding. So other examples, if there's a scene where you have, the stepdaughter is late and she gets into a physical altercation when she gets home and gets kicked out of the house. That may only take 1,000, 2,000 words. That's a scene in a chapter. Or, Elizabeth tries to initiate sex with Bertold and he rebuffs her because he's an alien and he's afraid she's going to find out. And the scene solidifies that he, needs to avoid emotional connection, and it also puts her into like an ego spiral because she thinks she's disgusting because of a comedy of errors. Like these are all things that would be encapsulation of a scene. They may not all be this lurid. They may not necessarily have to be as loud as these, but these are some examples. So other things that you can add to the scene would that are helpful are things that let you know the scene isn't working. A little bit of salt is great for a meal, but too much salt destroys it. So if you are seeing these kinds of things in your descriptions, they may be indications that the scene isn't working. So if you have a character ruminating over an issue for large sections of that chapter, this is probably an indication you're actually data dumping. You're using the thoughts as a cover for you to tell the reader more about the world or tell the reader more about the characters, and little bits of that are good, but if the entire scene, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 words is simply that character thinking about something, readers are going to skim further and put the book down. Having flashbacks, sometimes those work great, sometimes they don't. There's something to really, you know, focus it on to go, does this work here? Or, having a memory, reminiscing about something. A little bit of reminiscing is okay, but if it's in the entire scene, you're telling a lot to the reader instead of showing them, a lived in experience. If the character is learning about the world by watching or being told about stuff instead of acting, this is an indication that the scene is really just a data dump. So if you have a character who's, learning that another person loves archery and learning that another person, grew up in the Catskills and is learning about this because somebody is telling them about it, that's going to end up, probably sending your reader to a different part of the book, skimming that chapter, whatever. But if they're just experiencing something happening, but someone else is the actor, this is another issue. And your characters should drive the story. They shouldn't just be passive observers for the most part. Now, again, there are times where these things will work as they are, just because you have written them very well. But these are kind of like, the little flag that should get your attention that you should evaluate whether or not this is actually working for the story. Again, being educated about an object or detail of the world, the logistics of travel. If you're reading a detective novel, you probably did not have a scene that's 8,000 or 2,000 words long of the detective getting from point A to point B, spending 30 minutes in the car, unless there's a conversation that is really important to the mystery or a conversation that is really important to whatever their B plot is. With a family member or love interest, what have you, something else was going on in that scene. It was not just travel. If the person is walking around in a singular location and observing it in great detail, and this doesn't match the rest of your story, more than likely you were just kind of spinning your wheels trying to figure out what was going to happen next in the story. And this is now vestigial detail that you don't, necessarily want to put in front of a reader because it's going to bore them. And then again, doing mundane activities. This is kind of similar to the travel one, but waking up in the morning, the process of making dinner, having a play-by-play of who put down what card in a game, making a grocery list. Unless something else is happening in the scene that makes these things sort of like pregnant with tension, you may want to look at them and be like, did this need to be in the book? What value does this have? Am I just putting too much detail in? So this is a quick look at one scene that may be working versus a scene that isn't. So in this very first scene, the summary is the main character observes where they're going to be working for the next few months and evaluates the risks from local dogs and zombies. Woo woo, it's a zombie book. But they're just basically staring across a field at a location that they're supposed to clean out. Beginning of the book, you're going to have a lot more tell, but at the same time, they don't necessarily learn anything. They don't necessarily do anything. And we're just getting the background. So, does this scene work? So, this is the sort of scene list information that I would put in, but you may include extra stuff in yours, like characterization, if you're adding that in, if there's thematic stuff, that kind of thing. But the very bare bones is that you have the summary of events. And I mean, honestly, it's a little boring. Whereas the second scene, they go into whatever neighborhood they're going to be working in. They start working through a house. They, start a fire. They secure their location, and they find that their stuff has been ransacked. So there's been change in this scene. They're actually doing something. They're not just watching. And there have been changes to their physical circumstances, and they've also kind of created a situation where there's a mystery because, like, who ransacked their stuff, but also, like, does this put them in peril if they don't have supplies? So this is a pretty simple scene breakdown. And again, you can add other elements to it. There are, a number of ways to make a scene breakdown. And I've spent a lot of time on this, but this kind of shows you nothing's kind of going on over here. Do we need to do this? Or could we have started over here where there is action and there is, actual movement and activity? And then again, having this, change in their circumstance that they could have looked at. Sorry, I'm going too far. So this is a good way to do it. There's pros and cons to the scene breakdown. So we're going to talk a little bit now about beat sheets. And I've listed a number of different beat sheets, but there are a ton. Beat sheets are very good if you're writing a genre that has strong and clear expectations. The hero's journey or any sort of the monomyth alternates. The most common one I see is Save the Cat. These are Excel sheets that have been, oh, excuse me, you can get Excel sheets that have been tailored to these specific beat sheet expectations that include word counts, that will have information in them, like what specific beats you're supposed to hit at that time. And this can be good and this can be bad. But there's Romance in the Beat, which is very good for clean and sweet romance. There's Scaring the Cat, which is one for horror. There's the Story Genius or the Cause and Effect. There's a number that are just like this happened, which caused this happen, which caused this happen, which caused this happen, and require that sort of linear movement between events. There's mystery ones. There's a 12 step mystery formula, which is a little bit outdated in my opinion, but it is still really good. But if you're not writing in a genre that has specified beats, these might not be great for you. If you're writing literary fiction or if you're writing women's fiction, you know, you're writing something that's, metaphysical in nature and that doesn't follow a story structure, these are going to be kind of useless to you. However, if you're writing an epic, journey, more than likely one of these first two, the hero's journey or the Save the Cat, or any one of the numerous alternates for the monomyth, would be great for you to touch base with by making your reverse outline in them. So, this is an example where I can show you some stuff. So the overall goal mission in this, the opening is going to have to cover all of these things. And you can go through and check mark on the side, did I do that? Did I do that? Did I do that? Do I have a hook? And is it in this place? And if you like that kind of thing, if you like these very solid goalposts, then comparing your outline, what you have already written in the story, to these spots here inside of a beat sheet, then that might be great for you because you'd be like, aha, I didn't have a character state my theme. I need to go back and add that in. So your reverse outline can show you gaps based upon, the beat sheet. These, again, they don't work for everybody, but they do work in a lot of situations where you're writing genre fiction or you're writing genres, or writing in genres that have very clear audience expectations, or very clear expectations for your plot, to make sure that you actually hit all of them. So this is a breakdown from, somebody's beat sheet. And one of the things that I want to show you that, unfortunately, because there's not headers over here, but there's like the expectation for when certain things are supposed to happen. And this over here is when in the story it actually happened. So you can tell something is off. It may not be in this section, but something is off because the word count range is farther down in the story than where these things occur. And so this lets the author know I'm missing something, or the events that are occurring may be happening too quickly, and it's not hitting the beats where they're supposed to be based upon the length of the story. I need to go figure out what's going on. And then again, being able to compare what you wrote versus what your the expectations are inside of that beat sheet, those very clear guidelines that are in there, might help you be like, crap, I absolutely forgot this element. And when I go through and I revise, I'll need to add it back in. And lastly, the big one that I think is really useful, it would be book maps. And book map is also kind of a generalized term for a visual representation, an outline that is very visual, and shows you, either the processes. Sorry, my babysitter is letting me know that my child has gotten lipstick everywhere. Anyway, so a book map is a visual representation. It's a good time for visual representations, that can help you see where there are gaps in your story. So this is usually in Excel, but it also could be a plot line. I don't have a visual plot line, but you can look this up. And you're also going to break things down into either chapters or scenes and regard them based upon all of your different subplots. You can also include a check mark field or a check off field where you can see if all of the characters are consistently being shown throughout all of these, or if there's big sections where a side character is missing. And then you can evaluate if that's a problem. But it's a visual way to express what's going on. And so I'm showing a very small one, but you can see the chapters. They don't have to necessarily go in one direction. You have your summary of your scene or of your chapter, and then you have your subplots. And so you can see this subplot doesn't have anything there, and this could or could not be a problem depending on how important this is throughout the story. Like, if we don't get introduced to this issue until halfway through, is that okay? Maybe, maybe not. And there's stuff where things are missing. And so when you go through, when you see that a particular subplot or a character is missing, you evaluate and say, all right, is this a problem or is this not? So the one that I'm using is a highlight for problem. You could easily do it the other direction where you only show white if there's something missing. But as you can see, this subplot is ignored throughout in the gray, and this subplot over here in the blue is also missing throughout, and there's big sections where this subplot is also missing, just not as bad as these. And so when you see something like this, it looks like it's probably a dropped thread. And if you have a dropped thread, then when you go back to revise, you should pick it back up again. Or you need to figure out if that thread needed to be in the book at all. Is there a way to get this out of the book and the book still be okay? And if the answer is no, then how do you reintegrate that into the future sections where it's missing? And if you think about it and you're like, actually, it is okay because this is part of like a red herring. And if I address it here and then I address it, over here, when I come back around, it'll be all right. You can go ahead and remove the color, or again, you could do it vice versa. You can only highlight the things that do work, and clear out into white that don't. Just depends on what your visual preferences are. Eric asked to be the PowerPoint. We do have a repository for our PowerPoints. Sean, if you could add that to the chat, I would appreciate that. And I'm not checking the chat consistently, so if I see your question later, I definitely will answer it. I just may not be able to see it right now just because how my screen is. So you can use this to evaluate the subplots. You can add your themes in here if the themes are being addressed. You can include the characters on this. Again, you can do a checkoff field where you just show characters are here, 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 and here. And it's the same kind of thing where it's a grid system. But this is a good way to show you a visual, especially with color or color coding. Or if you're someone who actually prefers monochrome, the colors will let you know, hey, this is a problem. If you actually love color, you can make this a whole rainbow and only address sections where things are left out by having them be in white. And then when you go through to revise, then you will fill those in as you revise so that it'll look beautiful in rainbow for you. But yes, the book map is basically just the visualization of this. It doesn't necessarily have to be colors either. You can use, again, a grid system like this, or you can use a timeline system, or just anything else that you can throw a bunch of highlights into, or formatting that shows like, hey, stuff is missing. So when you do this, pick a style. What works for me may not work for you. This is always going to be a individualized choice. If you like having a lot of colors around and you're like, I think I would do great having those visual cues, cool. If you are orderly in a different way in your brain, you're like, I would much rather just go through and check off whether or not I hit the beats inside of a beat sheet. Cool, do that. If you like to do things freehand, or a genre restriction isn't something that you want to write to, doing just the basic summarization and scene sheet might be better for you. And then again, there's a number of different ways to outline. Anything that you write as an outline after you've already written the story down is technically a reverse outline. So if none of these work for you and you have a system that you prefer, especially if you write outlines ahead of time, matching that system is probably the best way to do it, especially if that is something that's tried and true, excuse me, in your life or in your writing. And if you're trying to find something that's going to help you out, being able to do apples to apples is probably the best way to do it. But go with something that you're actually going to engage with. If some of these look like way too much work and you know you're not going to do it, don't set yourself up for failure. Use whatever is going to appear to help the most that you will engage with, or that is intuitive to you, or you can see gaps in your plot, or you can see gaps in your character development more easily. And that's going to be the system that you should go with. So when you are creating this, focus in on your weaknesses when you are filling this out. If you know that you have a hard time with character development, one of the things that you should make special space for in your reverse outline is identifying if you've actually done that throughout. If if you have details inside of that section or that chapter that develop the character, or if those things are missing. If you see a pattern of like, I only talked about who they are as a person in the first three chapters, and then there's this huge gap until chapter 22 in the climax, where I give a bunch of background detail or I really explain the character. That's probably too long without having anything to do with the character's emotional arc or their personality development. But if you know this is a problem for you, include that in your outline so that you can evaluate it. And if the same thing, if you have a hard time with remembering to set the scene, you can have a column or a section where you say, did I set the scene? And if so, what did I do to set the scene? And it's important to include the specifics for these things because, if you are the kind of writer who in the first draft was discovery writing, you may find that a lot of these important details either get put in on the back end after they're important to the plot, or that they were put in the beginning and maybe what you thought was going to happen in the beginning wasn't what you thought was going to happen later, and those details don't match each other. And you've got background information about childhood in one place that says that this person was raised by a single father, and then background in another place that says like they enjoyed having conversations late into the night with their mom over the summers, and blah blah blah, that these two things just aren't in alignment, they're not in harmony, and you're going to have to go back and fix them at the line level. Having that already inside of your outline tells you where those updates need to be made. And that way they're also where you can see them, and you're not discovering them when you're halfway through a revision and then realize, oh my God, I've got this other thing I need to do. And oh crap, how big is this problem? Because doing it that way, on the spot, is usually a lot more overwhelming than, okay, I've gathered all the data and now I'm evaluating it, and this is just something else on a list that I'm already making. Other issues that people have that it's good to identify, these not deficiencies, but foibles as a writer, is if you have issues with fleshing out your secondary characters, if you have a hard time actually laying in red herrings, misdirections, or reveals to mysteries. This is important not just in mystery stories, but in any circumstance where your characters are making discoveries about their world or about other characters. Oftentimes, it's necessary to have red herrings and misdirection, especially in stories where you don't know who the bad guys are yet, or you don't know why they are doing the bad things. So the red herrings, the misdirections, the partial information on the page, it's important to have that because it will build up to a major reveal later in the story. But if those things are absent, or they're only being put in, the chapter where the reveals actually occur, this is a problem for readers. So in your revision, you want to go back and make sure those things are peppered throughout. If you do have important, you have themes that are important to you, or if you have no idea what your theme was, when you started writing the story and you figured it out after after it was over or halfway through, you're going to want to go back in and make sure that your themes are touched on in sections before you knew what the theme was, or in places where you're like, I need to strengthen the theme, or add more content relevant to the theme so that the one-two gut punch of that theme is really strong in the climax. Again, breadcrumbs. If you're big on writing a zero draft, you may not have breadcrumbs in that zero draft. You may not have included hooks in your story, either beginning of chapter hooks or end of chapter hooks, or even just hooks to specific subplots. Those are things that you may want to identify as you go through to make your outline, to make sure they're there. And then if they're not, that you figure out how you're going to put them in. And then if you have foundational elements to the story developments themselves or third act reveals, you want to highlight where those things are, or you should, excuse me, you should highlight those things in your outline so you know exactly where you've clued the reader in. And you can see if you need to do more to make sure that these things appear to be natural without being too obvious, or if you're going to accidentally make it seem like they came out of nowhere. So if any of these things are issues that you as a writer find yourself, pretty consistently needing to go back and work on, including those details in your outline will help you create a plan. So now you've made your outline. What should you do? First, before you try to use the outline, give yourself space emotionally from it. Rest, relax, get away from the content so that you can go back in and use relatively fresh eyes to evaluate it. I know you hear that a lot, before you revise, wait a few weeks, before you revise, put it on the shelf and walk away. And this is generally speaking good advice across the board, because this, doing the reverse outline and using the reverse outline as part of your revision process means that you are looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly of your story. And it can be overwhelming, or you can feel like this is such a slog, you just want to get through with it. But because your brain space is filled up with just problems and problems and problems, it's not necessarily filled up with actual solutions. And so if you walk away and you get some emotional space from it, and you can come back revived, and you can have better creative movement on your revisions because you're not emotionally drained by the process or just zapped by the number of things that you're going to have to fix. Giving yourself that space and that space away will help you just be more creative in general. So let it rest, and then we can bring it back to life later. And then you're going to put together the puzzle, evaluate your outline. Did you hit the beats on your beat sheet? When you were looking at your scene breakdown, did you find places where nothing is happening as far as evolution goes? Is it only background detail, or is the character, going in circles? These are things to look at as you go through. And then if you're like, man, I really focused in on this relationship, and that relationship problem is resolved 6 chapters before the climax, maybe I didn't quite do it right. So if you're seeing something that isn't working, use visual clues. If you're going to add in new information, on your outline somewhere, find a way to do it. If you're going to have revisions on a column in an Excel sheet, great. If you're doing a beat sheet, you may want to also, include a column to the side where you can see where your revisions are going to be. But try not to insert too much in the body of your outline where it may get lost because there's a bunch of visual busyness in that section already, or where it may get lost because it looks like everything else you wrote. So find either a different place to put it or find a way to use formatting to show yourself how you're going to fix it. So highlights are good. Again, setting it off to the side, using a different color font may certainly, okay, this is something I'm going to change. If there's stuff that you realize you're going to cut out of a chapter and then replace it with, using strike throughs can be helpful so that it's a visual cue for you. Okay, I got to go cut that. And then you have your other information as what you're going to replace it with. Or if you're going to move things around, you could put that in. Often we find when we go through that we have characters or a cast that is too big or unnecessary. And so you're going to like decide to merge things together. And this could also be scenes. You could decide to merge scenes together. And again, use some sort of formatting to show yourself like, oh, I need to go get rid of the extraneous or the now extraneous information, about this character since I'm folding them into be a like combined character, or I'm just going to give their scenes or their lines to this other character so that I can decrease the overall cast size. If this is the case, make a sign for yourself, like as you're going through, remember to get rid of this character's name so that you don't end up having Jenny through portions of the book, but Jenny also happens to be Kiki. And when people actually go to read, they're going to get confused because you have these two different names for a character that is now just one person. So put the pieces of the puzzle together. This is also good to say, like, I've got it. I laid out my breadcrumbs. I can see them on the page. And I can see where I did them, what chapters, what scenes I put my breadcrumbs in for the big reveal at the end, or for the reveal of the mystery, or, whatever it is. Or, man, I did a wonderful job of creating this very cozy setting, and it's got details throughout. There's not too many of them. They don't take over the scene, but I've checked this out and I've got cozy detail throughout. I'm on it. I don't need to mess with that. So you can put the puzzle together, good things and bad things, and figure out where your updates are going to be or should be based upon that. And again, this works for whichever kind of outline you do, but just make sure you have a clear place where you can see and make changes or make the plans for changes inside of your story so that when you go into the revisions, you can either use you can check it off as you go through your outline again and compare it to the scenes that you have. Or you can go through and see like, okay, today I'm just going to work on these things, and you can give yourself your own expectations. Because again, making revisions can be overwhelming. So you want something that is clear and delineated where you can say, this is all too much to deal with right now, but I can deal with this. And you won't come back and realize that you had details in six other places for changes that you've missed and forgotten. And now you've got to redo revisions without having been able to do the big picture stuff because everything was visually muddled. So just make sure whatever you're going to make changes with, that you have a clear place to put it inside of your outline. And then we've kind of talked about a lot of this already. Keep it visually simple. Create a to-do list based upon either the chapter or the scene so that you can check it off. But also so that you can encompass whatever changes you're going to be making. In situations where there is a problem and your brain just does not have a solution for it, one of the best things to do is to either make a comment inside of the manuscript itself or a comment inside of your outline saying, mumble, mumble, science, I'll fix it later, right? You may not have the answers yet. You're going to be doing a revision. Don't let it fall by the wayside, but still have a place where you're addressing it, where this is, a long-term thing that I will fix in the future, or not a long-term thing I will fix, but like this is something that requires either investigation, or I've got to do research, or I've got to go talk to an expert. I'm not forgetting it. I'm putting it in a place where I will remember to do it. But it is not something that I can fix in this next revision. It is something in the revision after that. If you are using an Excel outline or beat sheet, I actually prefer to put my revision space at the very front so that when I open the file, I can see it. Some people prefer it to be on the far end, but just make sure everything is uniform and in one place so that, again, you have that visual register and it's not in six different places on the outline where you're going to make changes. If you did create an outline beforehand, it is always good to do that apples to apples comparison with your reverse outline that you made on the back end to make sure that you didn't forget to put stuff in. Or if you did, like, is this content you need to go back and add, or was this something that you planned to put in, but it worked without? And if so, where are you going to put that content? Sorry, if it is something that needs to be there, where are you going to put the content? And if it worked without, Are there things you actually need to remove because they were relevant to that but no longer have relevance since that particular element or subplot or whatever has been removed? So it's always good to do that apples to apples if you can. Signs that the reverse outline may not be enough, that you may need to go back to the drawing board. And this is where you're doing your reverse outline and you realize that, like, either there's a logical issue between scenes or just in general, your characters are going off and doing things, but there's not connection. You may need to sit down and kind of figure out more on a developmental level what your plot is actually going to be. Because generally speaking, your plot should have, things moving in a linear fashion. Again, there are some genres where things don't. But presuming you're not writing one of those, if characters are just kind of going off at random or there's no clear motivation or what have you, you may need to do more revision from a big picture standpoint, and trying to do that in an outline may be too constrictive. If your first act cannot jump into the second, it means you probably started the book in the wrong place. And you may need to go back and figure out if you need to rewrite or reimagine that first act, and where your book started. Because if you don't have a point at which there's no return, or you don't have inciting incidences or what have you, if you're not doing that ramrod into the second act because the main character is now yanked into the other world, or into the circumstance and they can't go home again, this is an indication again that there's a big structural issue that you're probably going to want to go back to the drawing board and allow yourself freedom outside of an outline, to really reimagine the beginning of the story or reimagine the characters if the issue is the characters. If you go in and look and you wrote the story as Discovery, and you realize that your first act is really a different genre than what your climax would indicate. Um, More than likely, you're going to have to make like significant changes to one or the other. Maybe you need to write the story that fits that first act, and then write the story that fits that climax, but they're not the same story. So you may need to go back to more of a drawing board situation. And I mean, this can be clearly revealed in your reverse outline, but it won't necessarily be fixed by trying to keep all of these different sections or these big picture issues, and force them together. It just may not actually go. So if your content, yeah, sometimes fixes just need fixes. That's right, Sean. And doesn't mean that either parts of the writing are bad or wrong. It may mean that they need to go into a different project. And you may need to have wholly new content for this project. If you ended up writing stuff that was content inappropriate for the reading level, and this can go either way. You can write things for adults and it just end up being too juvenile, and you may need to go back and decide if that's really what you want to do, or it could go the other way where you're writing something for middle grade or for YA, and the content itself or the situations you find the characters in is just much too adult, for the genre that you're writing in. You're going to need to go back to the drawing board. If a very specific set of circumstances has to happen to meet your vision, but you can't find a way to put those circumstances into the story, that could be a sign either your interest in writing the story, the thing that caught your attention in the first place, doesn't actually fit in the story. Like your motivation for writing the story may no longer match, or you've written a totally different story than what you wanted to, and it just, those things are not going to mesh together again. If you find your character going on side quests throughout the story, I mean, there are subgenres where all they are side quests, but generally speaking, if your character leaves the story to go do other things, this is a sign that your plot has issues, and that you're going to have to go back and look at it on a big picture level to figure out how to get that character to stay engaged in the story, and to not drop plots, essentially, if they're just kind of walking away from problems or big picture arcs to go do other stuff. When you finish the book, you realize the real story happens when it's over. And unfortunately, that means that you have probably written a character's backstory, even if it is super long. And if this is not really a beginning, middle, climax, end kind of story, that this may simply be a giant character sheet. And that sucks. It sucks to learn about that. Or if the story doesn't actually happen, but we see a whole bunch of the world, we've seen a bunch of world building. This is something that unfortunately happens a lot with newer science fiction and fantasy authors. Um, the story is missing, and once you've done the reverse outline, you realize they just went over here and learned about this, and then they traveled over here and learned about that, and then they traveled over here and they learned about this totally new thing. Then that story is a vehicle for your world building. And all the information in your outline may not help you to create a story that fits inside of that world, or that works inside of that world. And big major changes are going to have to happen. So you can't have a true story instead of a travel dialogue or a travel log for the world building you've done. And so that means you got to go back to the drawing board. And then again, this is kind of the same thing that sections don't fit together, but if there's a lack of determinism between major events, if stuff just happens, if there wasn't this occurred, which led to this, which led to that, which led to the next thing. If there is not a domino effect or a logical flow, if there's a lack of interconnectivity, of logical interconnectivity between the bits of the story, then you don't actually have a story. You have like a fever dream, and you're going to have to go back and figure it out. So Rhonda pointed out, there are books, there are things that have vignettes. I'm not trying to dog genres where that is okay or normal, or where you have essentially short story compilations that are interwoven sections of a person's life, or that follow a theme. I'm not talking about that. If that is the actual structure of your story, ignore those complaints on the slide. This is more for common genres. So romance, science fiction, fantasy, horror, sci-fi, anything like. If you're writing something that is upmarket or literary fiction, some of these things that I'm saying may need actual revisions, may be part and parcel for that genre. So take what is relevant to yours off of this slide. um, and so when you see these, though, don't necessarily throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. These are things where you take it to somebody you trust and say, I think I'm seeing a problem. Do you see the problem? Or am I evaluating this wrong? Get feedback from one or two other trusted sources. And it could turn out, yeah, crap, I wrote a travel log when I wanted to write an epic fantasy. I'm gonna have to go back and just, in a very big way, rewrite the story. And that means that you may not want to keep the structure you already have. But you may not have realized it until you actually put it down in your reverse outline. Again, or you may go through and be like, damn, I am on it. Normally I don't know what's going on at this point because I've gone story blind, but I'm hitting all these beats and I'm good. And so the outline is just a really good way of getting that bird's eye view of your actual story without having to reread 50, 100, 150,000 words over and over and over again and just getting lost in the weeds. So we have a few minutes left. I do have about 5 minutes for questions. If you can't think of them, but you come up with them later, you can find me over at Shannon@tomeworksedits.com. This is our link to our bio site for all sorts of other things that Tomeworks does. You can find me on the actual website for Tomeworks. We're on a bunch of different social media under @Tomeworks Edits. And Anna was kind enough to make us this Patreon thing. We do not require payment. We do not put money onto the writers' lunches. But if you would like to buy us a coffee, or if you would like to help us pay for things like our Zoom account, you can go over to Patreon using this code and give us a little cash there just to make it easier to continue to provide these things for you. But I'm going to go through, unless Sean, did you see any questions that came up that I did not cover yet?
Not really. I think you got most of them. I think it might have been a question from Rhonda. What's a vignette? Although she could have just been remarking on, like, oh, you mean vignettes. But if you want to
Yeah.
go into that a little bit, but
So vignettes are usually self-contained chapters of a story, but technically flashbacks are vignettes. It's basically, something that should be theme relevant or character relevant, but exists sort of outside of the actual structure of the plot. Often, if they're done well, they show you a facet of that character. They fit in as like an invisible puzzle piece that makes the rest of it make sense. If they're not done well, then they just show up as sort of like this random did you know tell all section of 2 or 3 thousand words that sits on top of the story and derails it. So vignettes can be good or bad. There's not an actual problem with vignettes in general. It's more so if you see a lot of vignettes, this could be an indication of a story problem, but it could also be an indication of you doing a genre that's more experimental. I see
I
Anna. Oh, sorry,
like
Sean.
the idea. I like the idea very much as well of when you're going back, when you're looking at reverse outlines, how tight is your story, If a chapter or a vignette, or something like that is strong enough to kind of stand on its own. Like could be a short story that you could have published elsewhere. Can you pull it out, look at it, and even if you don't get the full plot, like it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, it's exciting or interesting in some way, even if there's no physical action happening and stuff. I am so concentrated on the chapter beginnings and endings and making those solid. Absolutely.
So I do see a question. Unfortunately, I am not a Scrivener expert, but I also see Anna has her hand raised, and I don't know if she has a question for me, but she might be able to answer the one. Do you have recommended ways to add notes, revision notes to Scrivener? So, Anna, uh, if you are able to answer that, please do. If you're not, I will see if I can find resources and send them to you, Susan, after the fact.
Hi. Yeah. So I have Scrivener on my computer. I haven't put in the work to get over the hurdle of learning how to use it yet myself. I have heard from several people who use Scrivener that there are lots of different ways to add notes. One that seems to be really popular is you can make like note cards for each, chapter or scene and put notes on those. I don't know how to do it, but if you know how to use Scrivener, you might already know how to do that. But I was raising my hand for another reason. There was a question in the chat about getting the PowerPoint slides afterwards, and I was really late to answering it. But we do have a Google Drive folder where we upload our slides. It hasn't been updated in a few months, so it needs to be updated with our 2025 slides, but it goes back to 2023. So you can see slides from lots of different writers' lunches on there. It might even go back further than 2023, actually. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I put a link to it in on that question. So there's a link to the Google Drive in the chat. If you scroll up a little ways, you can see.
Yeah,
I just wanted
I'll watermark this and then throw this up there today, so it should be there in the next few hours. That's a very good question, and I am honestly off into Linkwood, but I will make sure to get that there since you asked for it. Okay, we are a little after 2. I know not everybody was here when we first started. If you do have any other questions, pop them in the chat. I will answer them. But Sean, go ahead and remind us what we're doing next week.
Yeah, so next week we're going to be talking about traveling as a writer and checking out kind of like tips and tricks for making the most out of travel and using it for your writing. There are so many things from, the humor of David Sedaris to things like Ian MacDonald and how he did many different novels after traveling, going to a place, and then writing about Brazil or Istanbul or something. And he'd write futuristic sci-fi, but very much had elements of the contemporary place as it is today.
Sounds awesome. So I'm looking forward to that. I don't see any other questions. But again, if you come up with some or somehow I missed it, go ahead and email me at shannon@tomeworksedits.com. I'm happy to help, and I will get this PowerPoint up on the Google Docs this afternoon. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.